Everyone, thanks you for coming after lunch. Hope you're feeling not too tired and I can keep you a little bit entertained as well. I'm going what used to be a little bit futuristic, talking about IoT and the potential dangers of being attacked by a clone army in the future. And really the motivation was about, there's so many threats in the IoT, and we heard this morning, the talks before, some people looking at hardware, some people looking at software, and even in the security space, everyone you're talking to has got a slightly different view about what can go wrong. And most of the time, people are all right, because there's so many things that can go wrong. I just have a sort of a slight high-level view about what can go wrong. I mean, simple things. You can have somebody intercepting your communication, manipulating what's transferred over the wire or the wireless wire, devices starting to behave different to what they should, and your whole system is kind of compromised. Secondly, somebody has compromised the system and behaves as an attacker, sort of manipulates what's been done, and again, maybe takes down your operations. I mean, you certainly don't want to have one of these guys in your car that has been hacked, that communicates then over the CAN bus with all the other different systems and pretends to be doing something that they shouldn't do. The network can go down, and suddenly you don't have a way to communicate back, maybe with other devices or back to the base station. Have you prepared for this? And lastly, obviously, you've got this guy with a beard. You have got devices that might not be updated. They're long overdue for an update. There are known security vulnerabilities in these devices, but you might not have a mechanism to update them. So common things is, these days with smart TVs, probably like these, you have got on here. For about a life cycle of 2 years, you get firmware updates, and then it's kind of out of the mind and out of the product line of the manufacturer. And at the same time, for any software that goes in there, it probably takes about a year, 2 years until people find out vulnerabilities in that software. And then it takes another 6 months to a year to start exploiting them. So you see that the cycle of the firmware patches and when the vulnerability is going to be discovered are kind of largely disjoint. And then for the next 5-7 years, you have got this TV. It's basically connected to the internet. It's vulnerable, and nobody's updating this anymore. And so what's different to, let's say, IoT devices compared to desktop computers or, let's say, your mobile phones? What's the difference? So firstly, obviously for my mobile phone, almost every morning I see, okay, there are software updates, so I need to update them. Secondly, these things, they all work on the, very similar operating system. It's very much controlled by the manufacturer. On the other hand, on the flip side, sort of for your PCs, everyone has got, to be honest, a slightly different PC because you have got a different patch version, you have got Service Pack XYZ. You might have a Firefox browser with this plugin, but not that plugin, or an Internet Explorer or a Chrome. So they're very different. But for the IoT, everything is the same. So if you have got one device and you're able to take that over, you're likely to be able to take over 1 million devices because they're just clones of each other. And quite often, you yourself are not really in control of updating it. So who's really updating your TV? Who's updating your sensors, your smart home, your light bulb? How do you update a building automation system? Does the building say, oh, by the way, it's now my service time is 3 o'clock. I'm just going to shut down the building for an hour, but then I'll be back up and you have got the new operating system or firmware in there. So that's very different from a common problem that you have got with PCs or mobile phones and so on, largely because these systems are very much out of the hands of the end user. So you have to trust the manufacturer that they do the right thing, that they keep updating this, and that they don't get breached. And if they get breached, there's a way to remotely do this. And for the better part of the last year or two, I was basically the guy with the cardboard standing in front of the station and say, the end is near. That was a little bit my job. Until very recently, we say, whoa, what's happening? Because these things, and I actually changed my slides before coming here, these things I've been warning about for a while are now kind of reality. So it's no longer breaking news, it's kind of old news. So it started with, let's say, the attack on the site for Krebs on security, where there was an IoT botnet that was doing a denial of service attack for that website. And then later it got migrated. Later on, that code was made more or less public, and it was called the Mirai botnet. And then later on, you had got more and more attacks over the last 2-3 months on DIN, Deutsche Telekom yesterday, or part of the routers they use, and others. And in this case, the first one, sort of the big public one for Krebs on security, you had around 150,000 IoT devices being hacked, being connected, and being used almost like weaponized to attack a particular site. And thinking about this, it's a large number, much larger than what you normally would go to with desktop PCs in a, let's say, very simple manner, but certainly not the largest we have seen so far. In the Deutsche Telekom, about a week ago, they had 900,000 routers that were kind of compromised. Telecom was able to patch them or to fix the problem. And you can't even say it was really hacked because these things had, let's say, service port, default usernames and passwords. So it's not like super sophisticated vulnerability where you have got state-based actors spending months and years on it to hacking this. It's basically these devices were compromised or composed of different components from different vendors, including certain chipsets providers, and then built together, and nobody really knew anymore what kind of components were in there and what the features of those components were. And one of them had a service port, and this password has never been changed. And even if you buy a device like this one, in the end of the day, you don't know about this service port. Even though you have got, let's say, a web interface where you can change your username password, it doesn't go into the other access that's there from the hardware manufacturer. So, I mean, this obviously is very difficult to deal with, to maintain, and to see how to prevent this in the future. And so what I'd like to talk about today is a little bit where to go from here and what are the different components we should address. What I present here in the next couple of 20 minutes or so is not going to be a full solution that your system is going to be secure, but it highlights some of the different components and some of the different stakeholders that also need to come together. So I've got a split down into, let's say, the manufacturer, and then much less so is the end user or the consumer. And one of the things I firmly believe in, I mean, you should have some level of security when you produce a device, produce some software, or produce some component. At the same time, you need to have some kind of security when you combine or integrate things. Because as you've seen with the IoT devices before, none of them is sort of a single vendor, single developer product. It's always match and put things together, have different components, have different experts working together. And going back to the talk this morning about trust, this is probably trust but verify. In a sense, you should obviously have a certain chain of trust to your component provider, but you again should be reliable or should be being in a position that you can verify that these subcomponents adhere to a certain level of security and quality. And as said below, and I come to this in a few moments, from a consumer point of view, for IoT, you're quite often in a very difficult position because you just get a device, you don't know how it works other than the user manual might have. Maybe it's your light bulb you screw in and what do you know about what's in there and how to update this. And I think this is sort of a role where sort of external agencies or certification bodies can complement all the other activities. So let's start with what can the developer or the provider of such components do that's, let's say, reasonably makes a difference without requiring overly much expertise and time and so on. And so one of the key things from my point of view is everything that has to do with automation. Because if you see the different components for IoTs, quite often these are not huge companies, that are not especially software companies, and they can't afford to have like a penetration testing team come in, go there for 3 weeks or something like this, test that little device that goes somewhere, and then go out of the company and come back in 2 weeks' time when the next release or the next patch comes in. So the whole cycle about classical security where you design a full system, and then, just before you release it to the world, you have got all the security testing, and then it's good for the next 12, 24 months or something like this. Quite often doesn't work anymore in systems where there's a much quicker turnaround times, where people develop agile, where there's DevOps and all these types of things. So it's really a little bit of a mismatch. So from that point of view, automation and being able to react quickly or to develop quickly and add some certain level of security in, I think it's quite paramount. The other thing, obviously, is cost. So if you have certain software tools that help you to detect issues early on, it's typically much cheaper than having a dedicated team coming in and doing this over a couple of weeks. And I'm going to just give you a few examples what I mean by automation and integrating this in the software lifecycle. First thing I'd like to talk about is communication. So most of the time for whatever system you have got some kind of communication protocol. From, let's say, CAN bus in automotives to Zigbee to USB, HDMI, SSH, HTTP. I mean, the list goes on, and I've got like 200s on here. And you, as a provider of a product or a software tool, quite often you either take off-the-shelf components or re-implement certain aspects of that protocol. And this is not easy. I mean, reading those protocols and protocol specifications, oftentimes people make mistakes within the implementation. And even for like a TV, like HDMI, you have got the TV, and then maybe you have got the set-top box or the computer here, and they talk to each other. And typically that works quite well because both sides want to communicate and they want to behave properly. But what happens if one of the side doesn't want to behave properly, maybe behaves a little bit erratically, and drives the protocol that you talk about, let's say HDMI or CAN bus, into a situation that the other side hasn't anticipated. And there are tools out there, like fuzzing tools, that particularly you look at protocol communication and whether there's any way to drive that protocol into corner cases such that the system doesn't know how to react to it and then crashes, or there's a memory dump, and that allows a potential attacker to get in there. And unlike general fuzz testing, where you basically bombard the system with a lot of input data or randomized input data, there can be much more targeted fuzzing or testing of systems by having this background knowledge about what are the protocols that you use for communication, what are the weaknesses of that protocol, and which is sort of the if-then-else case. And the else case many people don't sort of check because that doesn't happen in regular operations. And this can be hooked up automatically to your test rig or whatever system you have, and then can be bombarded with input that's a bit smarter than just random data. And typically when we did this, I think we even have a demo here. You connect it to a device, and after a very short period of time, it says, "Ooh, I didn't expect this," and then falls over. And apparently that works with many, many devices you can find in this room and probably even in your home. Second thing, and that's not new, probably not new to you as well, integrating automated testing or analysis tools into your software development lifecycle means at the time you're writing code, you should have tools that also test that code, whether there's a certain known, let's say, weak programming practices or certain semantic security vulnerabilities in that code. Here's an example, static program analysis that looks for things like buffer overruns or cross-site scripting, SQL injections, and so on. And it's really a device that complements the developer. So quite often the developer might know about this, but it's a long day. I check code in at 2 a.m. in the morning because it's a close to release deadline, and I haven't thought about that what I do here actually impacts something over there in my code base. So that's where these types of tools come in handy. And the other thing is you can really integrate this into whatever continuous process or whatever process you have, and you get feedback right to some dashboard. You can have a look at it. What's the state of my project? And so that's why I also am here a little bit advocating some more, let's say, continuous testing and verification practices rather than the classical waterfall where you only do this at the very end. Okay, that's sort of just 2 items what I mean by automating security practices within the developer time and the developer community. The second thing is trust but verify. So when you have got components that get delivered to you from your provider, and quite often you have no idea what's in there. Most of the time when you assemble system and you assemble software, unless it's really very small specific microcontroller specific capabilities, people use certain open source libraries. Even for communication, you use OpenSSL, and that's you have done this. Many people have done this for a long period of time. But once somebody ships it to you, you don't know what's actually in there. And again, there's a sort of tools that look into both your binaries as well as your source code and try to match it up with what is known and what are known packages, what's known open source, which are the components. So you basically can get a bill of materials for everything that's commonly out there in the public space. And then it correlates this with also known vulnerabilities. And there are different organizations, including here I've got NIST, that provides basically 4 times daily updates about known vulnerabilities and which of those packages are affected. And then these tools cross-reference this information with the type of software components that come from your supplier. So in this case, you basically can have a always-on view about what might possibly go wrong. And obviously, this can be happening today, or you ship this, and then some security researcher finds out, by the way, this component, let's say OpenSSL version 1.2.11, something like this, we found an issue. And then you can get an alert about, this has an issue, and you compare this what you actually shipped. So you have a chance to react to this, and you know when to patch and when to update. And to be honest, with a lot of software, there's always a particular version that has got a particular issue, but it's very difficult to manually track it, which version actually has which issue. So you need to otherwise exploit a lot of people. So there again, automation, good idea. Another thing that people like to do is sort of monitoring your system. We heard about this before. And this really depends a little bit about what kind of system we are talking about. Quite often when you think about very resource-constrained small IoT system, it's difficult to have these monitors running at the same time. If you have got a bit more powerful system, or at least in your test rig, you can have a monitor that sits with the system and sees what's coming in information, what's coming out of information. Is this information as I expected, or does it behave different to what I have in mind? And does it sort of still satisfy the business processes or the operations I have? Obviously, that works very well with websites and other servers, so you can see whether this site still behaves as intended. As I said, if you don't have too many resource-constrained devices, it also works quite nicely. For the IoT, this is mostly useful for, let's say, the testing phase that you integrate it into your overall testing process and see if something unusual is happening. So this is sort of from the integrator side. The nice thing about these things, it allows you as a manufacturer to get a very good, let's say, real-time view about things that are going on. So what's working, what's not working, where maybe should I focus some of my effort, which of my suppliers I should have a chat to. That's the good thing. Also, obviously the not so good thing is all of these tools, they can't really tell you whether you design something wrongly from scratch. So if you have the wrong concept of security, if you never defined who's allowed to talk to who, this is sort of something that where you really need people and where you maybe need your pen testers and where you need your security team looking at your product. But at least you can focus them a little bit more intelligently and not to dig down to millions of lines of code manually in some kind of review process at the end of the product. Lastly, what I want to go on a little bit is about the role for the consumer or the role in extension of the consumer for standard bodies. And on the one hand, I have got, let's say, certification agencies like UL, IC Labs, TÜV, and so on. And all of them are currently looking into what can we do with IoT. Is there a way that we can put a stamp on it and say this is secure and it's not? And I think we haven't seen the end of the story yet. We just see the beginning of the story. I'm just going to have a quick chat about UL in a second. The second is organization, even here like IOSFT, MISRA in the UK, CERT in the US, or maybe ISO. There's let's say, an increased focus on about what can we define security in the, let's say, development and integration process. What does it mean? And it can range from security, let's say, coding practices and standards that can be checked to processes and things or checklists that you should do. And finally, the much-loved insurance industry. I mean, these days, cyber security insurance is a billion-dollar business. And I always wonder how that happens. And apparently, every now and then, somebody actually gets paid out when they get breached. But today, so as far as I know, the cybersecurity insurances basically cover operational cost or operational loss. So basically, your server gets hacked, and you need to rebuild this, and you need to buy a new piece of hardware just to be on the safe side. And maybe then one of these guys are paying. But the threat to your business overall, let's say business loss, the threat to your reputation, from the best of my knowledge, there's the cybersecurity insurance doesn't really cover this. And one of the reasons, I believe, is also because it's so difficult to estimate the premiums. So how do you know if you have two products or two companies or two anything, that one is more secure than the other, that one has got more, has done more work than the other? And in extension, what's the likelihood that one gets hacked over the other? And even if one is more secure, it doesn't necessarily mean they're not getting hacked, because people might just not like them. So they put more effort in this. So, I mean, I think that the insurance space is still evolving. Whether this will be sort of punitive or incentive enough to, push security further down the supply chain, I don't know. And it probably needs to be seen. So one thing I just wanted, and I took this from the UL website. So UL is one of the first one who started having a cybersecurity assurance program. And basically what they look at for your product is whether you have done certain processes and followed certain standards, which is all right. But they also run these types of tools I've shown before over your product. So they do the fuzzing, they do the component analysis, for example. If you have the source code, do static analysis. And based on the outcome, you either get the tick or you didn't get the tick. So that's I think it's a promising start. The second thing, and that's a bit different to many other things, so the assessment and the tick that you get is time-bound. And I think at the moment it's maybe a year. Because the argument is just because your system is secure today doesn't mean it's still secure tomorrow, because there's a larger, let's say, body of knowledge coming along, and people know about new exploits and new vulnerabilities. And in the meantime, you might have patched it. And obviously, ideally, the moment you do a software update, you should go through this. But at the moment, this is sort of a longish process. So you can't have it like a real time that every week you get a patch update or like a certificate update. But I think it's certainly something that's it's worthwhile keeping in mind. And I think it's a start of a longer process. Because in the end of the day, I mean, you as a consumer, you can't really say which one is better. I mean, with washing machines, yes, you get a label on it. What's the energy efficiency? How much water is it using? for the TV as well, but there's no security sticker that says this one takes care of your privacy, or this one has a commitment that if there's something wrong, it will be patched. No such thing. And generally speaking, I mean, the software industry is not very well known to provide assurances or guarantees. I've never bought anything and said, oh, we certify yes, and then you click something. Most of the time they say anything can go wrong. Are you happy with this? And yes is the only thing you can do if you want to run it. So in summary, there are going to be a huge number of devices, and then every IoT event, people say it's going to be so many billions or even more billions. In any case, it's going to be a lot. And I mean, the cyber crime and so on is already high. Again, you can pick any of those numbers. And education, skills, people available in the security space doesn't really catch up with the demand. Some people say there's not a skill lack, there's a financial or a salary lack, but whatever it is, things are not going to improve in terms of threat and that goes on in the near future. And so from my point of view, it needs really a lot of stakeholders coming together. Not all of them really have an incentive to work on this at this stage. So if you produce a simple device that goes into something else, like the security camera or the PVR, and just ship it and hope it's not your device that breaks the overall system. But that's ideally something we get back to. And if you're the integrator, I mean, you need to see that you get a view on the supply chain. I mean, we talked about the chain of trust. So what's the way that we can actually make this judgment whether we trust something or we don't trust something? And maybe there needs to be, actual hooks or certifications that somebody can validate that these claims are actually correct. Having said that, one of the future challenges, just quickly, and I think that's still quite open, what happens if your system gets compromised? What happens if you have got an IoT system, and let's say it's the air conditioner or the light bulbs people always talk about, just not to say it's the cars. What can you do to contain this, to shut this down? How do you, if the manufacturer has gone out of business, what do you do for the next 5 years? And is there ways to say, okay, we remove this from the global network? And if that network is indeed global, what does it mean? I mean, if we shut down a system in the US or the US and China or something like this, there's certainly people who wouldn't like this. So what's the overall global policy or the overall global approach to this? That's a kind of cross-border, not only cross-country or cross-consumer. And I think that's very much open how to deal with this. And I'm sure there's going to be people getting in trouble for this, to say the very least, not to say countries. That's all from my side. Thanks a lot for the quick after lunch attention, and happy to take some questions. Thank you.